Welcome on into the Chokehold Hour. I'm glad to have you joining me today. As you all know, UFC 305 is this weekend. We've been discussing the card. I've made a couple videos so far on the main event, the co-main event, and Perth, if I was in Perth, I would do anything to get myself a ticket for this card because like I said in my other videos with the matchups and the stylistic fights, it's built to entertain. But with that being said, this might be one of the very few fights on the card that could end up doing the opposite. It's Dan the Hangman Hooker and Mateusz Gamrot. Now, Dan Hooker is typically an entertaining fighter. If you think back to all of his fights, even his losses, like when he got beat by Arnold Allen, that was an entertaining fight. When he beat Jalen Turner, that was most certainly an entertaining fight. He knocked out Gilbert Burns. That was real entertaining to watch earlier on in his career. His fight with Paul Felder was back and forth. Like, it was a war the whole time. Dan Hooker is in the octagon to brawl. He likes to fight. He's a fighter's fighter. He is someone, it's why there's a reason he's a fan favorite. His style breeds excitement. Now, on the other hand, Mateusz Gamrot actually does quite the opposite. Has some significant wins in his career, Arman Tsarukyan, but Rafael Dos Anjos, Rafael Fiziev. But let's talk about those wins for a second. So, the Arman Tsarukyan win. Close fight. Very close fight. Maybe could have gone either way. Arman looked good on the feet. I don't know how many takedowns Gamrot shot exactly, but a lot of them. Now, his fight against RDA. That was at UFC 299 in Miami. RDA hurt Mateusz Gamrot badly, a couple times in the first 45 seconds of that fight. An older, much more out of prime RDA hurt Gamrot. What did Gamrot do for the rest of the fight? He wrestled. That's Gamrot's style. Now, in his fight against Rafael Fiziev, whole different story. Rafael Fiziev threw a kick and ended up tearing something in his leg, so the fight was called off. Gamrot celebrated away anyways, because in his eyes, it's a legitimate win. He did best another man in the cage, but Curtis Blaydes doesn't think his first win over Tom Aspinall was legitimate. When a man tears something due to an unnatural movement that's not caused by you, it's hard to say you actually beat them. And that's really my issue with Mateusz Gamrot is that he is a good fighter, but he just doesn't actively seek a finish ever. That's my issue with him. He really is. He fights to win. He fights smart, sure, but he is a guy who you will not see. He doesn't even search for submissions when he has top control on the ground. He's literally just sitting on top of you. Now, I'm not saying he's not an elite grappler or an elite fighter, but his striking abilities are overwhelmingly subpar. Beneil Dariush handled him quite easily on the feet. That was one of the loudest overhands I've ever heard when he landed that shot. Mateusz Gamrot is a talented fighter. He's talented, but he is incredibly flawed on the feet, and his wrestling is just so good. His cardio is so good that it makes up for everything else and all the flaws in his stand-up game. Now, let's talk about Dan Hooker for a second. Dan Hooker's a savage. His last fight against Jalen Turner blew my mind. I'm a big Jalen Turner guy. I think Jalen Turner has champ potential, or at least I did. I'm not sure where his career is going to go, especially after the most recent loss against Money Moicano. But yeah, I'm a big Jalen Turner guy. I think his striking is elite. That's another Mateusz Gamrot versus Jalen Turner. Another very close fight. Jalen Turner pieced him up on the feet, and Gamrot just shot for takedowns for the entirety of the fight. Mateusz Gamrot barely got by Jalen Turner off the good grace of his wrestling. I thought Jalen Turner should have won that fight by split decision because he did more damage. But speaking of Jalen Turner and Dan Hooker's fight, that was one of the craziest things I've watched as an MMA fan. I know it's not a highlight reel knockout. The fight went to decision, but I don't know if I've ever seen a head kick land that flush and not knock anyone out, really. It wasn't as flush as the Kamaru Usman-Leon Edwards head kick, because Leon had Kamaru lean right into the shin. Nonetheless, that was shin to the dome. Jalen Turner landed a picture-perfect head kick, and somehow, Dan Hooker stayed up and went on to win the fight. That was amazing. That was just unreal to me. So, Dan Hooker is a savage. Like I said before, he's never to be counted out of a fight. And because of his incredible chin, he is a stylistically nightmarish matchup for a lot of strikers. A lot of them. Mateusz Gamrot's not one of those guys. This fight seems like one of those fights. It's kind of laid out all right there in front of you. Like I always say, I'm bad with sarcasm. I need things laid out for me. Well, if you're an MMA bettor, everything seems to be laid out perfectly for you here. I mean, Mateusz Gamrot, an elite wrestler, Dan Hooker. The last time I watched him face an elite wrestler, it was a verbal tap. Islam Makhachev. Do you guys remember what he did to Dan Hooker in the first round of that fight? I mean, he put him in a Kimura, and Dan Hooker, being the savage he is, didn't physically tap, but he was screaming in pain. A verbal tap is almost worse than a physical tap because that means you are at the brink of destruction for whatever body part it is that is being squeezed or pushed, and in that case, it was his shoulder. Yeah, Dan Hooker got mauled by Islam Makhachev, but Mateusz Gamrot, great wrestler. Mateusz should be able to do the same thing to Dan Hooker. It really seems to be right there. You have an incredible wrestler against a striker who has a subpar ground game. The safe bet and the obvious pick here is Mateusz Gamrot by decision. I feel like that is one of the freer bets on the card. Just because, I mean, Dan Hooker, he hasn't shown me high enough level capabilities from the bottom for me to be confident enough to say, okay, Dan Hooker can defend the takedowns. He can get back on his feet when he's on the ground, and he can win this fight. It's hard for me to say that because I haven't seen that from him really, whereas Mateusz Gamrot has shown time and time and time again that he will take you down and hold you there. And that's going to be his game plan coming into this fight at UFC 305. It'll be no different than any other fight Gamrot's fought. It'll be no different than the RDA fight. No different than the Jalen Turner fight. He comes in with a game plan and he executes. If he does execute, he'll win. Now, with that all being said, I stand by everything that I just told you all. If you're betting on one underdog on this card, if you're betting on one, I kind of like Dan Hooker. I know it sounds crazy because I just said this might be the freest bet of the card. Mateusz Gamrot by decision is relatively a lock. And yeah, that's true. I would say, I mean, let's say there's 100 different times Mateusz and Dan Hooker fight. 85% of the time, it's going to be Mateusz by decision. But, let's just think about the venue right now. Dan Hooker, the hometown hero, trains at City Kickboxing in Australia. The fight is in Perth, which is in Australia. All of Dan Hooker's fans will be there to rally around him, rally behind him. He will feel that energy, use it as fuel. He's coming into this fight with momentum, just won a fight that he should not have won. Jalen Turner looked tremendously better. He found a way. He willed himself to win. And maybe, just maybe, he can do that at UFC 305 with two ways. There are two paths to victory for Dan Hooker that I see as possible. One, you catch Gamrot early, put him to sleep in the first round. Just drop him, a few ground and pound shots, done. Gamrot's done. Because we've seen him hurt before. He can recover, but he can also get hurt. Any man bleeds. So that's one. Dan Hooker just finishes him early. Two, the UFC does not like Mateusz Gamrot. I guarantee you that. I know. I don't know Dana White personally, but we all know how Dana White thinks. I mean, Muhammad Mokaev just got cut from the promotion. Maybe it's because he was more trouble than he's worth, but I mean, not being an entertaining fighter helps too. If Mateusz Gamrot tries to wrestle for the entirety of this fight, and Dan Hooker can just keep it standing for even a minute and a half to 2 minutes of each round and land significant shots in those minute and a half to 2 minutes, he will be awarded the decision, especially in Australia. He will be awarded that decision because if Gamrot has another Jalen Turner-esque fight, they're not going to give the wrestler the decision. I promise you that. If this fight is close and it goes to the judges' scorecards, if it is a close fight, a genuinely close fight, and Mateusz Gamrot might have done a little more on the ground, but Dan Hooker's work on the feet was just enough to maybe get him the nod, he will win the decision because the company, Mateusz Gamrot's not a company man. He just doesn't, as a young boy, I would say this all the time, he doesn't risk it for the biscuit. He just doesn't do it. He plays it safe every single time he goes out there, and that's why he wins so consistently, but it's also why he will never be champion. It's why he will never have an incredibly large fan base. It's why Dana White will never give him favorable matchups. I mean, he's beat so many high-level guys, and now here he is fighting Dan Hooker down in the rankings. There's a reason for that, guys. There's a reason for that. Mateusz Gamrot is not the company's favorite fighter, and that's because he's not all that entertaining. Now, he's very talented, great wrestler. Mateusz Gamrot is probably the safest bet on the main card. But I try not to root in fights. I try to stay impartial. But in this fight, I'm rooting for Dan Hooker. Go Hangman.